Good evening, fellow Liberty-meers. My name is Jeffrey Tucker. I'm here to talk to you this evening about Keynesian economics, a little bit of its history and a little bit of its heritage, its meaning, its theories, its repudiation by world events. It's a fascinating and very strange topic because it's a great testimony to the astounding persistence of a really bad idea. It's something that just seems to never go away. Certain theories in science that come along, they're downright wrong. It doesn't matter how many times they fail, they still persist. I mean, I remember when I was in graduate school, there was the widespread impression that Keynesian economics, as traditionally understood, was completely dead and that nobody took it seriously. In fact, I remember the neoclassical economists used to make fun of the Austrians for constantly harping against the Keynesians because they said, nobody believes that anymore. Nobody believes in Keynesian economics anymore. And yet, yeah, okay, maybe they didn't briefly, but we look at it now and it's all back again. It just keeps coming back again. And nobody can seem to make it go away. So, you know, I mean, you know, in some sense, Keynesian economics is the new orthodoxy, which is just very strange. Partially, you know, it's because of one person named Paul Krugman, who got the Nobel Prize some years ago for his trade theory. He has a very interesting, he used to be a free trader. And his trade theory was not incompatible with a kind of a old-fashioned sense of free trade. There was nothing particularly wrong with his free trade book. In fact, a good friend of mine, Austrian economist named Mark Brandley, used to, I'm going to clean my lens here real quickly. Okay, that's not a very brilliant cleaning job there, but Mark Brandley used to highly recommend Paul Krugman's book on trade theory as a good free trade textbook. This is before he got his Nobel Prize. You know, unfortunately, he got his Nobel Prize for free trade, and that's great. But you know, I remember at the time when he got it, I was talking to other people at the time. And I said, "Well, it's not so bad. He got he got his Nobel Prize for his trade theory, and his trade theory is not all that terrible. So surely that's not going to bleed over into you know using that platform to revive traditional Keynesian theory, which he seems to be somewhat sympathetic to." My friend said to me, are you out of your mind? Of course it will be, because we have this weird national ethos where anybody who gets a Nobel Prize is presumed to be smarter and better and brilliant than everybody else on whatever they're talking about. It doesn't really matter. So of course Paul Krugman will use his platform to promote terrible theory. You know, it's typical of my outlook on things. I always sort of overestimate the rationality of people. And next thing you know, of course, he's got a New York Times column, and what does he write? Twice a week or something? It's just insane. And it's a column designed to make people like you and I just go crazy. You know, you could write 10 columns against his every one column. And then he's got another column, you know, as soon as that one's been refuted and so on. And it seems like, you know, he's this kind of like ever-growing monster. Like the more you attack him and criticize him, the more prominence he gets. And the more he feeds off of it. I mean, he's kind of creepy in that way. You know, I mean, it's one of these people that loves more than anything else getting attacks and criticisms and then lashing out again. So of course, you know, he's really good at lashing out the Austrians. He hates us, you know, more than anything else. I mean, the Keynesians have always understood that the Austrians were their key enemies, and I think that's right. I don't know where we want to start with this history, but I think before going all the way back, I would just like to make a few comments about this. When you look back at the 20th century and the great economics debates, you know, there were so many things going on. There were socialists, there were the fascists, there's the communists, there's the Keynesians, there's the revival of Austrian economics after World War II. That's the death before World War II. The disappearance of the classical model of economics, its replacement by a sort of a marginalist neo-subjectivist economics. Then you had the rise of a very interesting free market school with Milton Friedman, who probably single-handedly probably more than anybody else did, the most to revive sort of pro-capitalist feelings in the popular mind, probably during the 60s and the 70s more than anything else. So it was a very confusing time. So it's hard to kind of say, well, what was the critical debate? Who and what were really countering each other, Well, my friend John Papala made these couple of videos a few years ago. It was sort of pop videos using, hip hop styles and house styles to illustrate economic truths, and he made two of them, which pitted Keynes against Hayek as the great contenders in the battle of the century. And when I first saw those videos, I wondered whether or not they were correctly characterizing intellectual history. But the more the time has gone on, I think he's onto something. I mean, they really were the great contenders, at least in the English-speaking world, which, if you look at the way history turned out, is the world basically. The intellectual world of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that was sort of barely hanging on in the interwar period was basically vanquished away with World War II. The intellectual world of Spain and Italy, and France was seriously diminished and harmed by this compromise of politics during the war. And you could say the same thing about Japan, and China had its problems. So in the end, the continuity of intellectual ideas and the real firmament has been in the English-speaking world of the 20th century. So, and in that world, there were two great competing schools of thought. I mean, Keynes came along, as a brilliant, super compelling, beautiful, charming, tall, good-looking, rich, aristocratic, top-flight intellectual in the 1930s, and swung into a kind of a gulf or the absence of theory during a period when laissez-faire was very much discredited. And even before his general theory came out, was probably the most prominent theorist in the entire UK for sure. And then with his general theory, which if you haven't read, I mean, it's actually worth reading, because in a weird sense it makes no sense at all from first page to last. I mean, it's an attempt to render economic life as through mechanical metaphors, really, from the beginning to the end, absent any understanding of human choice. In a weird sense, like, Keynes had an undying propensity for reversing cause and effect in all economic affairs, and his tendency towards aggregation, combining huge forces, aggregate supply and aggregate demand and consumption and capital, in big homogeneous blobs, and shoving them into equations with, nonsensical pairings, rendering fallacious mathematical equations and things. It obfuscated all the interesting parts about economics, but because he did it speaking as a non-socialist, right? Not interested in overthrowing the capitalist system, but anxious to have it managed very thoroughly and completely by government. That was sort of exactly what the politicians of the world really wanted. And it came along at exactly the time to justify every kind of terrible economic policy of the New Deal and in the UK. And by the way, in pre-World War II, fascism. I mean, let's never forget, actually, that book, the theory, general theory, it was instantly translated all over the world, and that there's a German edition that came out, I believe, let me think, I want to say 1935, but it might have been 1936. I think it might have been 1936. So Hitler's already in power. Already the Jews are being driven out of the country. The universities were being purged of the liberals. Book burnings were going on. The Nazis with brown shirts were marching in the streets. It should have been pretty obvious to everybody what was going on. But the German edition comes out with an introduction by Keynes in which he says, I'm very, very happy with the developments in Germany because my theories are more suitably implemented under a system of totalitarian economics than in a world of laissez-faire. So now, I mean, does that make Keynes a Nazi? No. Does it make him a fascist? I mean, I would say yes, if by fascism you mean a planned economy that directs production from the center by an elite that is enormously powerful and has access to unlimited resources with a printing press. So, and yeah, that is a system that I think even today is best described as fascistic. And so, yeah, to that extent, I would call Keynes a fascist, although certainly not a cultural brown shirt or anything like that. If you really want to sort of dip deeply into the personality and history of Keynes, who he was as a man, as an intellectual, as a figure, I can recommend. I mean, there's a pamphlet that Murray Rothbard wrote that's just, I think, about the best short thing that you'll ever read, apart from the biographies, and it's just called Keynes the Man. I mean, you can Google Keynes the Man. You can Google it up really quickly. It's got some fascinating details of his life and his intellectual heritage, and particularly his role in the ruling class at the time. Well, his competition turns out to have been, F.A. Hayek in many ways. But again, as a result of an accident of history, it might have been Mises, okay? But Mises, didn't leave Austria until 1932, whereas Hayek had come to England to teach at London School of Economics. I believe it might have been about it was about 1932. I think Mises left in 1934 for Geneva, where he pretty much lived in obscurity for 6 years while he wrote National Economy, which is the basis of human action. But in terms of a public intellectual, Mises had disappeared. Rupke stayed in Germany, of course. The Americans were caught up in their own worlds and weren't ready to confront Keynes. But Hayek landed in London, so you had the pitting together of Hayek against Keynes. And Hayek had long thought of himself as an opponent of Keynes and had systematically refuted every one of Keynes's sort of books up to this time, and had been severely critical of him in the economic journals. So by the time but every time Keynes would, or Hayek would come out against Keynes with a great refutation, Keynes would just simply say, "Oh, that old book? I don't believe that stuff anymore." That's neither here nor there, and it frustrated Hayek to the point that by the time the general theory came out, Hayek was not interested in taking it on. He just kind of ignored it. I mean, later he realized this was a terrible error on his part, but he was exhausted of attacking and criticizing Keynes. He figured, well, Keynes would come out with another book in a couple of years and repudiate this one anyway, so what does it even matter? So he didn't refute the general theory, and how was he to know, in 1936, that this book would sweep all before it and become the prevailing doctrine? In fact, it was very alarming for that whole generation of Austrians and anti-Keynesians and free market theorists, from Mises to Rupke, to Haslett, and everybody, to see a kind of a whole generation of economists gradually, swing from market orientation and a belief that under conditions of depression, basically, you had to kind of let the system work itself out. That the depression was caused by maladjustments in the capital structure as a result of expansive monetary policy and interest rates that weren't coordinating the structure of production consistent with the rate of savings. To see them shift over to this kind of demand side hydraulic mechanical metaphorical approach of Keynes that basically the conclusion of which was we need to manage the macroeconomy through the opinions of and powers of experts. And this happened to many, many people. And let me just quickly tell, and I'm sorry for those of you who are listening who have heard this story before, but I think it's fairly interesting. One of the major figures who was very active in German-speaking intellectual circles, and really one of the great geniuses of the interwar period, his name was named Gottfried Haberler. And he was very much of an Austrian, although kind of a soft Austrian, but super intelligent. He wrote a brilliant book called, you have to look it up, but it's called Crisis and Depression, or maybe it's called, you have to look it up, look up the title. It's got the word depression in it. But it was a kind of a survey of business cycle theories. And he's very critical of, sort of Keynesian theory. And he has a whole chapter on the Austrians that's very, very good and very sympathetic and nicely done. Can be criticized. I think Roger Garrison's criticized him in places, but mostly it was a very good book. Well, Haberler gradually got converted over to the cause of Keynesian theory. And as far as I can tell, a lot of his conversion came about just from having met him. I mean, Keynes was like a mysteriously, like magically compelling figure. Like anybody who would go around him would be sort of weirdly drawn to him. His beauty, his tallness, his erudition at cocktail parties, his connections with the elites. He was just that kind of guy. And he had a way of always sort of saying things that you wanted to hear. And he was sort of intellectually malleable, so that everybody could sort of pour their own belief into him. And once you do that, then he becomes, like your spokesman, and you're sort of highly sympathetic with it. Well, that happened to Haberler. I mean, he just became, by the 1960s and 1970s, just kind of a soft Keynesian, but nonetheless more sympathetic with the Keynesian position than the Austrian position. This changed later in his life. He grew more sympathetic to the Austrian position, as he got older. But anyway, I just wanted to tell you the story because, I had this very strange experience when I was a young man that Gottfried Haberler was at the time living in Washington, D.C. And for whatever reason, because of an article I had in the newspaper or something, I don't know what, but I picked up the phone and he said, Jeffrey Tucker? And I said, yes. He said, well, this is Gottfried Haberler. Please come to tea. I was like, what? Gottfried Haberler is like alive and living here and I'm going to go to tea with this guy. Okay. Can do this. So I went over to his house for tea and we had a rip-roaring time. It was really lovely. And, of course, for me to meet, one of the great intellectual figures of the 20th century, I mean, like a little younger than Mises, I mean, like that kind of intellectual and brilliant, beyond. He was an epic figure, right? So I'm having tea with the guy. It was really, really great. And then we would go out to lunch. We used to hang around AEI together, American Enterprise Institute together, with Irving Kristol and have lunch and all the top economists there, the top guys from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund used to hang out at the American Enterprise Institute. So yeah, I became sort of like really good friends with Haberler. In fact, I co-authored an essay with him, which is just bizarre as I think about it. But as he got older, and I was sort of stuck on these weekly teas. Like you're not going to turn down Gottfried Haberler for a tea, So every Wednesday I would like, come to tea, Jeffrey Tucker. Okay, I'll be right over, Professor. And so as he got older, he started getting sort of bedridden and sicker. And he would lie in bed, actually, sometimes when I would go over to his house and come visit him, and his servants would bring us both tea. And he would lie in bed, and he'd ask me, he'd say, can you read to me today? And I'd say, well, sure. What would you like me to read? How about some Mises or some letters of Hayek, maybe? And he'd always say the same thing. He'd say, read me Keynes. I was like, oh, brother. Okay. So he'd say, let's try volume 2. So he's got the collected work of Keynes on the wall, right? So it's like 17 volumes of letters and correspondence and books and, the whole blather of Keynes's entire life. So I, grab volume 2 and he'd say, start on page 200. and I'd start to read Keynes, and I'd do a dramatic reading of Keynes. And this old, brilliant man, you know, colleague of Mises, of that same generation, would lie there in bed with an ethereal, heaven-like smile, and you know, at paragraph after paragraph, and when Keynes would say something sort of dryly funny, Godfrey Harbler would laugh uproariously. You know, here he is, you know, 95 or something like that. And I'd spend, you know, an hour and a half reading Keynes to the guy, and I'd say, well, listen, Professor, I have to go. Thank you very much for coming. It's wonderful. Great to see you. Come back next week. And so every few weeks he would do this, make me read Keynes to him. I mean, anyway, I tell that story because I think it's interesting that even after all that time, Gottfried Habler would still be so like completely entranced by the magical personality of this man that in his old age, even after he had swung back around to liking the Keynesian, liking the Austrians again, would still be just all about Keynes, you know. So that's for me a very great insight into just how compelling a figure this must have been. Well, okay, yeah, but so back to the battle between Keynes and Hayek. They really were pitted against each other, and make no mistake about it, sometimes people are a little bit hard on Hayek because, you know, because he wasn't Mises, right? I mean, if you read the Constitution of Liberty, you'll find plenty of stuff in there that, you know, from a pure libertarian point of view will annoy you. For that matter, the road serfdom is the same situation. I mean, you know, you've got a guy who just wasn't so good at defining precisely what it meant by private property or exactly what human liberty was. He was kind of a searching intellectual, a little bit afraid of didactic assertions, suspicious of overly formalized definitions. So, you know, you've got to kind of get into the Hayekian sort of swing of things to sort of get what he's good on. And you might be tempted to think he was not a very good opponent of Keynes because, yeah, like I say, he wasn't Mises. I think this is wrong. And there's no question that Hayek was the great anti-Keynesian of the 20th century. You can find this out for yourself. If you Google up an appearance that Hayek made on Meet the Press, okay, and this was like the 1975 or 1976, when, you know, the whole world just knew that the cure for all unemployment was massive inflation, massive government spending. You know, and so the newscasters, you know, were just like, they had on this heretic, almost as if the whole point of having him on was to harass him, you know, and make fun of his views. Hayek was absolutely uncompromising. You get a sense of who he was and how passionately he felt. He never believed in any sort of counter-cyclical policies, at least when you watch that interview. Hardcore, anxious to let the depressions run their way out, recessions to clear themselves out, let the markets clear, restabilize. It was against intervention in labor markets. It was completely against any kind of inflation. I mean, if you're accustomed to thinking of Hayek as being soft, you should watch these interviews because he's actually hard as nails. He's wonderful. He really held up the anti-Keynesian line throughout his entire life. He never did write his gigantic, systematic refutation of the general theory. In fact, it's pretty interesting to think about it. That refutation of the general theory didn't come along until, I believe it was about 1958 or so, with Henry Haslett's critique, a gigantic book called The Failure of the New Economics, in which he takes Keynes apart, you know, page by page, from beginning to the end. Now, there are a couple of things that were wrong with there's a couple of reasons why this book never really sort of took off. One that you conventionally hear is that Haslett was not an academic economist. I mean, he was a journalist. So you'll sometimes hear people say, well, that book was never taken seriously by the economic mainstream because he wasn't an academic economist. So I tend to distrust those kind of explanations. First of all, they seem too easy, and they presume that if Haslett had been, a professor at, Princeton or Dartmouth or Yale or, Harvard or so, which he wouldn't have been, but if he had been, that somehow the world would have said, "Oh, now we see the errors of Keynes." That's not really believable, because if you think about it, look at somebody like Murray Rothbard. Okay, so he was at Columbia University when Man, Economy, and State came out. I think that he wrote that maybe just as he was getting his PhD, or maybe just immediately following, but it was certainly, a highly credentialed economist, and smashed, utterly crushed every aspect of Keynesian economics. And that didn't make any difference. So I don't know why anybody thinks that Henry Hazlitt's book would have made a difference if he had an academic position. I don't believe that. So why didn't it make a difference? I think part of the reason is that there were so many iterations of Keynesian theory after the general theory came out. So the book comes out in, but I'm sorry, my dates are a little bit mixed up, but I think it was 1934. And it was just a muddled mess. Like, nobody could make sense of it, really. And it took several generations of economists to continue to sort of chew on it, codify it. All the Keynesian theory that was common in the 1960s and 1970s, had very little to do, even in its language and certainly in its mathematics, with the original Keynesian vision. It was interpreted over and over and over again, recodified, reconstituted, perfected, put into sort of a textbook syllogisms that students could understand. So it had very little to do with it. In fact, there's all these legends, that I don't know when Keynes died, but that before he died, in fact, Hayek actually tells one of them that he was talking to Keynes, and Keynes said something like, "Look, what is being called Keynesian economics today, I don't even recognize, and I don't accept it." So it doesn't surprise me at all that Keynes would say that. I mean, that's sort of the essence of Keynes. He was constantly changing his mind. So, I mean, I don't actually take that seriously. I think basically Keynes would say anything. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Keynes never really endorsed any New Deal policies as such. He was actually really critical of things like blue laws. He would say, "Oh, well, that'll never work. The price controls are ridiculous." Like, no matter what governments did, he'd always like distance himself. I mean, he'd recommend policies, and then as soon as they were implemented, he would set himself apart from them and say, "Well, that's not really exactly the way it should be done." So he was just a very clever ruling class intellectual in that way. Okay, now we're halfway through this seminar. I've not really addressed what we're here to address, which is L. Albert Hahn's amazing book called The Economics of Illusion. Economics of Illusion. This book was I think translated into English sometime in the 1950s, but a lot of the essays came out in the 1930s, based on work that Hahn himself, who's a highly trained, expert, a member of the economic establishment, on essays he had written originally in the 20s. So this book is extremely interesting, and I think it's really regrettable in some ways that, like, this book is not well read. I mean, I found it about 5 years ago and put it online because I found it so engaging and wonderful. But as far as I know, nobody had really paid much attention to it before then. So I think it's one of my favorites. For one thing, it has a really good explanation of Austrian business cycle in there. That's definitely worth reading. But so what makes this book interesting is this. L. Albert Hahn confesses in great detail about how, when he first became an economist and started writing in the 1920s, that he himself was a Keynesian. Now, how is that possible? Because Keynesianism hadn't existed. Well, Hahn says that there was nothing new in Keynesian theory. No aspect of it was new. Not its view that consumption drives, production. Not its view that inflation can cure recessions. Not its view that high interest rates are an inhibitor of production, and that the way to dig yourself out of a recession is a low interest rate. None of these positions that that investment tends naturally towards routine bouts of expansion, overproduction and underproduction, that you needed government spending to balance out these failures of the market, that the price system doesn't work. All of these sort of common tenets of Keynesian theory were already around in the 1920s. Keynes, all he really did was resurrect this old theory and repackage it in a way that was politically saleable and appealing to the political elites at the time when it was needed. Somebody was asking in the question box, why is it called the general theory? Well, so Keynes was very interested in attacking classical economics at its very root. He sensed its vulnerability. Since about the 19th century, you know, the age of laissez-faire, as Mises would call it, between, say, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the 1810s, up till, or 1830, I guess you could say, up until World War I, was generally considered, the great age of laissez-faire. Free trade, no capital controls, free migration, no passports anywhere in the world, a period of massive accumulation of private property. There were no income taxes. There was no such thing as Social Security. Central banking didn't exist. I know this is sounds like I'm describing utopia, right? You're like salivating. A beautiful world, plenty of problems to extent. The age of liberalism was slow in coming, but it was, obviously you had the persistence of slavery, cronyism everywhere in the world. But in general, this was more of an age of laissez-faire on a global basis than it had ever been. But in the late 19th century, what you saw was a kind of a remarkable transformation happened in the world with the advent of this kind of onrush of massive, awesome, dramatic, sweeping, transformative, technological upheaval. When you think about it, electricity, which had been discovered a long time ago, had now become the norm. So it was not unusual to find houses of the elites, especially in the 1880s, that had indoor lighting. In the 1890s, the World's Fair, showed off every kind of new electrical gizmo. Nighttime baseball became popular. The whole world was beginning to light up. The age of darkness was leading to the age of light, thanks to electricity. Awesome. With railroads, all throughout, again, through the age of laissez-faire, suddenly transportation that used to take 6 months had been reduced to, 3 or 4 days. You had the ability to port food around to various, so people didn't have to depend on raising on eating all their own local stuff. So there's many people in the world the first time had tasted what a head of lettuce was like. Canning, allowing meat to be moved from here to there. Telephony, was an awesome invention. Even more extraordinary than that was the telegraph. Right? That was the single most transformative technology alive, because for the first time you could port ideas across, and that was from the 1830s forward. You could now convey ideas and port them across large distances, even across the ocean, in real time. So you saw the linking of the New York and London capital markets for the first time, and Chicago and New York, and the Western settlements in the United States were suddenly in a technological and economic and communicative sense linked to the East Coast, and the world began to really sort of, the heartbeat of the world just really began to pump for the first time, thanks to the communication technology of the telegraph. And the internet's nothing other than an elaboration on the telegraph, really. Before the telegraph, the only way to get messages to anybody was through a note in a bottle, or smoke signals, or to travel by horse, or whatever. suddenly with telegraph, you could get instant communication anywhere in the world. Telephony, flight, awesome. And let's don't forget what's quite possibly from the regular point of view, from the point of view of the regular person, the most extraordinary innovation in the 1880s and 1890s, which was the mass availability of affordable, useful products in steel instead of iron. With iron, you could not build bridges. It's too heavy, forget it. With iron, you could not build skyscrapers. They would fall down. It's crazy. Steel was so durable, so light, so beautiful, and so commercially viable, made it possible to have bridges and made cities possible that we see around the world today. Steel built the modern world. And with it came, many other innovations, and like I mentioned, flight. So all these things are sort of on-ramping onto the world all at once. And the intellectual establishment and the political establishment became completely intrigued about the high status of the combination of the practical arts, meaning innovation and that sort of thing, and engineering, putting things together, building things, very beautiful. And there was an exaggerated attachment that began to develop around this engineering metaphors, because it was so awesome to see what engineering and the practical arts could do to the world. There's a presumption that everything in the world must operate that way. So that's when the economists, and they were, considered to be deviant economists in the 1910s and in the late 19th century and the early part of the 20th century and the 1910s. But they began to reconstruct economics based on these sort of engineering metaphors, to think that you should run an economy the same way you run a railroad, or you should build structures of economic life in the same way you build large cities, with experts, with resources and plans. And out of that comes a whole series of fallacies. But it represented a repudiation of laissez-faire doctrine in the classical sense. So, but they were always sort of a minority in the profession. Albert Hahn was one of them. So when Keynes came along, he cobbled together what he called the general theory as a way of sort of fundamentally attacking Say's law. Say's law meaning that in the long run, market's clear, basically that production will not persistently take place in a way that's inconsistent with consumption, because if the consumption is not there, then the production is not going to last. And it's another way of saying markets work, markets clear, prices work. Keynes, in the really early part of his book General Theory, just takes on Say's laws and says, misrenders that as supply creates its own demand, and then just tosses off a quick dismissal of it, thinking that in so doing he had overthrown the whole of classical economics, and then rebuilt economics on a different foundation. So what's intriguing about this book, what I find extremely interesting, is to discover that Keynesian economics had already existed as a kind of a heretical form of engineering-laden, metaphor-style, sort of government planning, upside down, backwards understanding of economic life, had already been around extant all in the previous 30 years. Hahn had been hearing of it, realized that this is just a series of fallacies, and they come around to a free market perspective. So from his point of view, and he was German, when the general theory came out, he was like, what is this infantile, backwards, fallacy-ridden crap that I'm having to read? This is idiotic. This has no role in the world. So he, like many people, he just never thought that it was going to take off. But of course it did. So he wrote these series of essays as a as a massive attack on Keynes and an attempt to prove that Keynes had not actually done anything new. He had just reconstituted a series of fallacies. So that's what's so wonderful about this book. I also like this book because it's proof that Misesian, or what we call Austrian business cycle theory, was not unique to Mises, but had been a prevailing view all over the German-speaking world. And for that matter, it was all over the United States. I mean, don't forget that, you know, one of my favorite journalists of the period, the interwar period, is Garrett Garrett. And his book, The Bubble That Broke the World, came out in 1932 as a thoroughgoing explanation of why the stock market had crashed and why the US had fallen into recession. His answer was, you know, overhang from war debt, too much Federal Reserve monetary stimulation in the late 1920s, government spending and indebtedness that led to a distortion of the capital structure that turned inward on itself, had to right itself because markets work, because Say's law is persistent reality. And his recommendation is that you know, we pay off the debts, that we adopt sound money, that we cut government spending, don't run deficits, and so on. So this is The Bubble That Broke the World, 1932, widely circulated, well published. He was a hugely prominent journalist. So it's not the case that the perspective of Mises and Hayek was somehow idiosyncratic and strange, or for that matter, that it was innovative. It tied up a few loose ends, but the basic structure had been in place already. I mean, you can even read about, I mean, for that matter, you can read Thomas Paine's book on money and banking and see that he had the basics of the Austrian capital or Austrian business cycle theory in there too. I mean, the problems of fiat money and monetary expansion have long been known. There wasn't anything unusual about that. So what we see being revived suddenly then in the interwar period is this weird new battle that pitted an old fallacy, newly fashionable because of the perceived failure of laissez-faire, pitted against, you know, a kind of an old-fashioned belief that markets work. You know, a kind of a revival of classical economic doctrine. And those are the two great schools. So I think the idea that Hayek and Keynes were the great competitors is not an incorrect understanding. In any case, to go back to my original point about this sort of strange persistence of Keynesian theory, I mean, there's a sense in which Keynesianism should have died in the 1970s. I mean, Murray Rothbard writes about this often, about how when he was in graduate school, you know, everybody believed this stuff. And one of the claims, I'm not sure that Keynes himself ever believed this, but sort of later Keynesians came to believe that there was this direct trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So if inflation was getting, rather if unemployment was really high, was above the natural rate, as they consider it to be, then the way to bring it down was to inflate the money supply. And that would cause a real lowering of wages in real terms, without actually having to cut anybody's wages, and lead to more hirings and reduce the unemployment rate, even if it, you know, also caused inflation to go up. And if inflation was getting out of hand, then all you could really do was acquiesce to a higher unemployment rate, and that it was the job of the planners in Washington to constantly calibrate between these two things, inflation and unemployment. They didn't move in tandem, but they always moved as like a seesaw, you know, in opposition to each other. So it's really up to the elites to decide, you know, which is better, which is worse, which is the worst of two evils, high inflation and high unemployment, but you had to choose between the two. Well, come 1976, you started seeing what was called in those days, I don't think it's still called that, but stagflation, which was an economy that was facing high inflationary pressure. At the same time, production was so stagnant that it was throwing people out of work. So you had the two things happening at once. It's like a brake and a gas on at the same time. And the persistence of these two things, on the face of them, would have refuted what was then called the Phillips curve, namely the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And you'd think that, you know, if economists were scientists at the time, they would say, well, there's something wrong with that theory. We better get rid of it. But no, that didn't happen. You know, stagflation came and it went, and it seemed to have no effect on Keynesian economics. Even so, you know, I mean, I think it's really true that throughout the 1980s and the 90s, the fashion for Keynesian theory really went into decline. I mean, the Reagan Revolution, so-called supply-side economics, as a repudiation of the so-called demand-side economics of Keynesianism, really made great headway, actually. And Keynesianism was kind of very unfashionable and left in sort of refuted. And I think this pretty much persisted into the great, you know, collapse of when, right? 2008 was the year that changed everything. Don't forget that 2008 was a direct effect of the monetary policies pursued since 9/11, actually. 9/11 led to an inflationary monetary policy, combined with a massive spending on the part of the U.S. government, creating a massive bubble that happened to land in housing because of the way the institutions were structured. You know, the prices were going up, just outrageously, eventually collapsing. Highly leveraged investment banks that were carrying these mortgage-backed securities based on bad models of interest rates, suddenly saw themselves facing, an unbelievable calamity on their balance sheets and financial meltdown, leading to TARP and trillions of dollars in new money creation to bail out the entire ruling class. Basically, that's a short history of what happened in 2008. But you need a theory to justify all this. And suddenly that's where Keynesian economics comes along. It's all back again. It was never dead. The zombie is alive, walking the earth, doing the thing, and suddenly Keynesian theory is all back again. It's very interesting, isn't it, how fashions in economic opinion tend to follow politics, which I always tend to think of politics as a kind of a lagging indicator of cultural change. And I think that's still true. But something that lags even further behind than politics is elite academic opinion, actually. Anybody who imagines universities as being these great sort of fonts of advanced opinion that are sort of weirdly driving forward, the structure of the world, is sadly mistaken. If you've ever been in universities, and what you find is a vast risk aversion to new ideas. It's no different now than it was in Galileo's time. I mean, people don't, the academic class doesn't like new ideas. They tend to just follow what the ruling class wants, just in general. And it's true in economics too. So suddenly after 2008, and through the efforts of people like Paul Krugman and many others, Keynesianism has undergone a massive revival. And Austrian theory and free market theory and classical economic theory just, still is very much behind, is still very much a minority opinion out there. So Keynesianism keeps coming back because I think for the same reason it came back the first time with the general theory, namely that Keynesian theory is very good at giving an intellectual cover to the ruling class. I don't think that's the only reason, but I think that's a major part of the reason. In fact, on the margin, I think that's probably the explanation that matters the most. So back to Hahn. This is why this book is so important. It shows us that there's nothing new under the sun. That Keynesian economics had long predated Keynes, so that Keynes had just taken his ideas from other scribblers. And there was nothing but a jumble of fallacies, and it still is. And you can see these fallacies recreated in real time in the New York Times every time Paul Krugman writes an article. Okay. Well, here's what's interesting to me, and something I don't entirely understand. It seems incredibly apparent to me that all of the fiscal stimulus and economic stimulus and monetary stimulus that followed the 2008 crash did not work. Eventually, what has righted the economy, if you can say that it's been righted. I think we're sort of in a permanent recession, actually, by the standards of where we should be, given the technological changes. And we should be experiencing, 12, 13, 14, 15% growth, given the amazing technologies that have come online over the last 10 years. Instead, we're sort of languishing at 2 and 3 and 4%. It seems like a permanent state of recession to me. I mean, I would say that it's clear that the policies after 2008 have not worked. Boy, but Krugman just refutes that. I mean, if you read the work of Bob Murphy, he never stops attacking this idea. I mean, he writes it again and again. Their predictions were wrong. The economy did not bounce back. We've had the slowest rate of recovery ever in history. Entire economic structures all over the world are being bogged down by massive government regulations, debt overhang, all the rest of it. And there seems to be no getting out of it. It's all a consequence of a bad economic policy. Now, let's just kind of look at a couple of things that are going on right now, just to kind of underscore the point. The first one is China. I don't follow the Chinese economic situation very well. Some people call it the second largest economy. Other people say, no, that's nonsense. It's already long ago beat the US in terms of overall productivity. Be that as it may, China's undergoing a massive correction in its capital markets right now. The stock market's falling all over the place. And the Chinese government has already intervened to stop new initial public offerings and new offerings on their public markets, which is actually a very serious intervention. So some people believe that this is a kind of consequence of a long period of inflationary finance by the central bank. Now, that very well may be true. I think we have to wait and see, how bad is it and how much worse is it going to get. But things like this just makes you worry a little bit about the status of the world economy. I'm not, of the school that everything's going to fall apart and we need to have a bunker in the backyard. I don't believe that. I think basically the reason we recovered after 2008 is we saw housing prices collapse and the market eventually cleared itself, despite every effort by the central government to prevent it. Eventually the markets do speak, right? And I think it's going to be the same thing this next time around. Another good case is Greece. And here you had a classic Keynesian attempt to create a centralized fiat currency for the whole of Europe that united, monetary policies across states without addressing the problem that each state has a different fiscal policy. Foundation for Economic Education has an excellent article by Bob Murphy. If you just sort of go to fee.org and Google Bob Murphy and the euro, you'll see he actually explains how this works. You can't have a central bank policy that basically guarantees the capital markets and macroeconomic structures of all these individual states, as long as these individual states still have sovereignty over their fiscal policies. It doesn't make any sense. It's an unstable situation. I mean, he argued there that the euro actually can't work and that it was a real mistake. And I completely agree with him. And the Greece case is a beautiful illustration of that. What we saw, I guess, yesterday or this morning, Greek voting no on yet another round of bailouts, in effect means that Greece is going to be leaving the euro. If I were Greek and I had gone to the polls, actually, I'm not Greek, and even if I were Greek, I wouldn't have gone to the polls. I know that. Okay, I would have stayed at home blogging. But if I did go to the polls, I definitely would have voted no on that referendum, because another round of austerity to keep the euro alive is just not what Greece needs. Now, probably what Greece is going to do is go back to the drachma eventually, and they're going to have to massively devalue it. There'll be a period of inflation, if not hyperinflation in Greece, to get rid of the debts, the indebtedness, have to start all over again. But it's a real opportunity for Greece. I mean, if you handle things right, Greece could become, a kind of a miniature Hong Kong of Europe, and I think that would just be amazing. The only chance they'll have for doing that, in any case, is by getting out from underneath the thumb of the European Commission and this strangulation that the euro is providing them right now. So I think this vote is actually I think it's good news. I know it's a little bit of an anti-liberal element here, because I think probably the sort of neoliberal forces within Greece would have been very happy to stick with the euro and undergo another round of austerity. But I mean, you know what? They've already tried this 3 or 4 times. So I'm just not pessimistic about this vote at all. But in light of these two things, I want you to notice something that I find really interesting. Yet another repudiation of Keynesian economics. Okay, so one of the things that Keynes was really passionate about is, in fact, you can say this like a central passion of his whole life. He hated the gold standard. He thought it was just the great inhibitor in the world, and just a kind of a Victorian leftover, a sort of a puritanical attachment to you know, high moral values and bourgeois culture. He just thought it was ridiculous, and then we just desperately had to get rid of the gold standard. Here's a lot of the reason why. The gold gradually declined, you know, from the end of from the stock market crash all the way to the 1970s. Keynes' big goal was to create a world without gold, where a world of pure fiat currency. Now, if he was right about that, you never would have seen the advent of these safe haven currencies. Like gold became very valuable in the late 1970s. You know, if Keynesian style nationalized fiat money systems were so fabulous, why would you have people all over the world rallying to buy things like gold and to get into a gold standard? It doesn't actually make any sense. But what's happening is really, really interesting right now to me. What I find amazing, I haven't checked gold prices over the last week. I did see a little bit of a bump the previous week, but I'm curious to see what happens there. My prediction is that gold is not, the value of gold is not going to, or its exchange rate with dollars is not going to reflect the level of crisis in the world economy, in China and in Greece, to the extent that we might have expected this to happen, say, 10 years ago. And so what's on the move today? Have a look. Have a look at the Bitcoin price. Right before this seminar began, I had a look. I checked it. It was 276, which is a phenomenal rise from only, I think, like 30 days ago, where it was languishing at 225, 230. That's a big boost. And if things get worse, we're going to see more and more interest in it. And it's not just because. It's not just because people are buying Bitcoin as an alternative to the euro, you know, or to get their money out of Greek banks that have now limits on withdrawals, or because Chinese citizens are suddenly going, oh, I must have Bitcoin. That's not the thing. The thing is that the world economy has been so unstable for so long, people look for a safe haven. Cryptocurrency is that new safe haven. It's the new gold. It's got all the properties of gold. It's divisible, it's, you know, it's scarce, it's portable, it's durable, much more durable, believe it or not, than gold, if that's even conceivable. But what's more amazing than that is that it's weightless, and it takes no space, and it can be transported peer-to-peer between any two people in the world, as long as either of them has connection to the internet, which links to the distributed ledger that keeps track of it. I mean, it's an awesome innovation, an awesome currency. So in light of that, Bitcoin's value is on the march, despite the fact that there's always downward pressure, price pressure on Bitcoin because of increasing rates of adoption, where people are using the Bitcoins and they're being accepted by more and more vendors and immediately sold for dollars. That puts downward price pressure on it. So when we see upward price pressure on it, that's pretty massive, and it's pretty intense. So it's the growing perception of the instability of the world economy, the unviability of the euro, which is now, I mean, this is the first really big crack in the status of the euro with this Greek thing. It's going to be very serious. And if this China situation gets even more intense, this is the first big crack since the Chinese economic boom. That's really going to show the vulnerabilities of the Chinese economic system, and we as Americans are used to sort of, let all economic problems, belonging to everybody else, and the dollar somehow miraculously surviving. I don't believe that. I think where it's just the U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar is just as vulnerable now as it was in 2008, if not more so. So I think what you need to do in order to understand where Keynes really went wrong, or proof that it's wrong, is look at the safe haven currencies, which used to be gold, but now look at cryptocurrency. I mean, every increase in the value of Bitcoin relative to whatever currency you want to translate it into is like a constant repudiation of Keynes. Okay, I'm out of time. Thanks for letting me talk so much about this fascinating topic. I think it's so interesting. And I barely touched the surface on it, but I hope I gave you a nice introduction. Have a look at that Hahn book and see what you think of it. I wanted to thank, I understand we have a new member with us tonight that joined because of this seminar, so that pleases me very much. Liberty.me should have 50,000 members, maybe 500,000 members. You can help us by getting out there and evangelizing for this great project. And you all know, since you're here, what a great community is, and how fun it is to be part of the gang of winners. Basically, we're on the right side of history, and times could get hard sooner than we think, and it's nice to have friends to commiserate with, to share ideas with, and to dig our way out of the rubble and continue to build a freer world. Thank you so much for coming to my seminar. And I look forward to seeing you, I think, next week, right following Freedom Fest. Okay, all the best. Take care, Liberty Meers. Night, night.